Welcome to the Wounds That Do Not Heal. My name is Tressa Brady. After my own experience and hearing time and time again about domestic violence in military families, I decided to start this podcast. Tune in for stories, resources, and guidance on how to get the support you need for your family and your safety. Have you guys ever seen those 2020 episodes where they have a hidden camera and they go and commit outrageous acts in public to see who might intervene? I don't mean pranks like on Impractical Jokers, but I mean they do things like stage a domestic violence incident, or they'll be on the street with hired actors and have a child sitting alone or on a park bench, and then you'll see another adult hired actor who comes in and tries to lure them away. And they're trying to see if a third party will step in. And you see person after person glance over and just dismiss it. None of their business. They go about their day. They haven't seen anything. They're pretending at least, and they're not getting involved. And just as you're losing all faith in humanity, a person will speak up. And I feel like it's always like a little old lady or old man or somebody who'd be really ill-equipped to fight off an actual bad guy. But they're usually the ones who find the strength to jump in. And just as they're preparing to call the police or they're yelling at the offender, John Quiñones pops out of the bush to interview them and find out what made them get involved. The person will always say something like, because it was the right thing to do, or because if my son or daughter was in that situation, I'd really want someone to help. Wouldn't it be amazing if everyone thought like this? I always find myself yelling at the TV at the people who don't involve themselves. It's just never been my nature to mind my own business. Clearly, this is why I always find myself in trouble. But I just feel like if you see something happening, you should get involved. And I'm fascinated by people who do not feel this way. I also am just incredibly nosy. So if I saw a couple where one was verbally or physically assaulting the other, there's just no way I could just keep on walking and not insert myself. I feel like all day long I'd be obsessing over what was going on. What was that person say? What happened? Actually, I met my best friend because her ex-husband assaulted her and left her in a gym parking lot. And she came walking into the gym that I was managing, and long story short, I ended up saying, here's my house key, here's my address, promise I'm a nice person, go move in with me. And that night when I got home, there she was, moving in with her 2-year-old son, just like that. Talk about a leap of faith on both of our parts. That was 15 years ago. And later on, she would be instrumental in convincing me to get away from my abuser. So it all worked out. But anyways, I just cannot physically mind my own business, but many people can. And beyond that, many people can see horrific things happen, take a look around at those not doing anything, and be influenced by others' decision to do nothing. This is a phenomenon I believe that is sometimes called groupthink. Possibly the most infamous situation that I can think of like this is a story some of you may be familiar with of the rape and murder of a woman named Kitty Genovese. Kitty was a bartender that was raped and stabbed outside of an apartment building in Queens, New York. 2 weeks later, the New York Times published an article where they erroneously claimed that 38 witnesses saw or heard that attack, and none of them called the police or came to her aid. The incident prompted inquiries into what would become known as the bystander effect, what I referred to earlier as groupthink, and sometimes even referred to as Genovese syndrome. Textbooks would go on to be written about this phenomenon for psychology students to pick apart for decades to come. Now, years later, it would be determined that a few witnesses had attempted to contact authorities and that a 70-year-old witness had ventured out to see what was going on, and that old woman cradled Kitty in her arms while she was dying. It does make me emotional in itself that this woman found the strength and bravery to do so. But that bystander effect originated from the Kitty Genovese event. And while it wasn't completely accurate, it would be a phenomenon that would be witnessed in future events. The bystander effect is a psychological theory that describes how people are less likely to help someone in need when others are present. And this can occur in a variety of situations like violence or bullying. And some of the reasons that researchers believe this phenomenon occurs is that people feel less of a sense of responsibility when other people are present. They may feel fear of judgment if they do intervene. And also, they may feel like the situation is just less emergent when they see nobody else is jumping to react. One of the things I've recently learned, I learned about when I interviewed Dr. Shauna Springer in episode 2. She, if you recall, is one of the nation's leading experts on PTSD and war fighters and our first responders, and she's led efforts to prevent suicide in this nation's veterans. One of the things Doc Springer discussed with me when we initially met was moral injury. It was something I'd never heard of. Now, she's also a 3-time best-selling author, and she discusses moral injury in some of her books. But Doc Springer explained that a moral injury is a psychological response to events that violates a person's moral compass or deeply held values. They may cause feelings of shame, betrayal, anger. Many warfighters experience moral injury when they're in combat, when they're involved in events that just go against their moral code while they're deployed. This type of injury can occur in an individual who just witnesses an act that goes against their code of ethics. It can leave long-lasting feelings of shame and guilt and self-loathing for their involvement or for their lack of intervention. And that type of injury has been linked to PTSD and depression, so it's very prevalent in this nation's veterans. If a veteran witnessed a death or failed to prevent an immoral death or followed an order that seemed inhumane, it could gravely affect their mental health and leave them with lasting moral injury. The tragedy I have for all of you on today's episode combines many of the subjects I've discussed on this show on my social media platforms, as well as a few new ones. I'll discuss PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, moral injury, suicide, war crimes, cover-ups and collusion, and yes, even murder. Now, I say tragedy because I believe that's what this was. Most tales of murder involve some level of evil, but I do not believe this to be the case in this scenario. I think a monstrous act was committed, but I do not believe the perpetrator to be a monster. I often find myself wondering if monsters are born or made. I also believe both things can be true. But for the soldier we're talking about tonight, I've labored over the question, had he never served, would he have ever killed? I know my own thoughts on that, but I'll be curious to hear what listeners think. I take you to a beautiful town to talk about this service member, not far from where I live now. San Clemente, California, home to Private John Needham, who in his early 20s was your typical surf bro. You know the type. He was an artist. He spent his days making art, painting. He painted houses. He worked freelance for companies. He just used his creative flow. He worked in different surf shops, and he spent his time on the water as much as he could. Now, he'd long considered joining the military as he came from a long line of veterans. John's father, Mike Needham, was in Army intelligence. His grandfather fought in World War II, and I believe he had a great uncle who even died in the Alamo. According to John's grandmother, he'd wanted to grow up to be in the military like the men in his family since he was about 6 years old. But since high school, he'd been enjoying his life of relaxation and using his creative mind. Eventually, though, John came to a point where he longed for the camaraderie and the brotherhood that the military promised. I heard him say in an interview that he felt there was nothing more beautiful than signing up for something where you had every intention of laying down your life for the guy next to you and they for you. So nobody could have imagined that in the end, it would not be John dying to save his brother in arms or saving a brother in arms, but rather taking the life of an innocent young woman. In March of 2006, John Needham joined the military at just 23 years old. He was sent to Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, and by the fall of 2006, John was deployed to Baghdad. Ironically, this is where I was at the same time, and my significant other was amidst a flurry of deployments with his Special Forces unit as well. This time period was of significant conflict in Iraq and was in fact the most lethal stretch of time in the War on Terror. 904 U.S. soldiers would be killed in 2007 in Iraq, and John's unit would see a great deal of combat and casualties. John took to war like most people couldn't even imagine. Much of John's personal testimony I learned by watching an old 48-hour episode that I highly recommend. You can also listen to it on the 48 Hours episode podcast called Private Needham's War. But they share his own voice and thoughts quite a bit, which gave me a great deal of insight into the type of person John was post-war, because sometimes hearing it in a person's own words can add value versus just reading it. But when John described his time in the military, he spoke about how he thrived in that environment. He described himself as this gung-ho, motivated, the first-in-the-door guy. He talked about how on every mission he went on, whenever people were lagging, he was the motivator. He was actually given the nickname the Need Hammer because of his nonstop persevering attitude and his desire to push others to continue on. He was just constantly pounding and encouraging others to do the same. The time John was in war was, as previously mentioned, during an extremely contentious time in Baghdad. John was involved in several conflicts and also the recipient of multiple awards for his time. He was in Baghdad for 11 months, but in those 11 months, he saw more combat and missions than many combat soldiers do on multiple deployments. He served, and he served well. During his 11 months, he earned multiple honors. Some of that would include a Purple Heart and an Army Commendation Medal for protecting people on his team during an ambush. During that ambush, John's head was pinned down without his helmet, and he felt impact after impact of round hitting the concrete around him, and the walls around him explode. John would survive multiple IED and grenade attacks, and in all he suffered concussions, shrapnel wounds, a fractured T9 and T10 in his back vertebrae. But John was on patrol the very next day after incurring those injuries. He was told to lie by his command when he was at the hospital so he wouldn't be taken out of combat. Something I've learned personally is all too common. These men don't want to leave their brothers and go home. They'll lie to stay, even if the cost is their own life. John was in excruciating pain physically, but he admitted the psychological damage was actually far worse. As I discussed earlier, psychologists in this country are now starting to better understand that soldiers will in fact suffer what is called moral injury, and that can be detrimental to their mental health. Some ultimately even being driven to die by self-inflicted means when they can't rectify their part in an incident that caused them the moral injury. I believe this is what was causing John a great deal of turmoil while he was still deployed. John shared that during his time deployed, he would see women maimed, their mutilated bodies in the street. He would see children's bodies cut up, mutilated, and burnt. And he struggled a great deal with an incident he was involved in with his unit that seemed to cause a detrimental moral injury to John's psyche. John would eventually go on to write a letter to Army brass detailing the events he witnessed and the war crimes and atrocities his unit committed. The Army would claim to have looked into this ordeal, but ultimately, all of the men banded together against John, and the Army didn't feel there was any need to further pursue looking into the war crime he claimed occurred. Now, I want to circle back to earlier where I mentioned the bystander effect or groupthink. I believe in a setting like war where emotions are insanely heightened and death is all around you, keeping your moral compass in check can be really challenging. You may not even be sure you're going to live. You're seeing your closest friends die. You may see others committing acts of war and say nothing, because at that point, you may not have the mental capacity to do so. And then later, when your mind has had time to process the event, you may feel an incredible sense of shame or regret for not intervening or saying anything. And I can't judge anybody at war because I've never been, and I can only imagine what that level of depravity could do to a human's mind. For John, some of those events he witnessed were just too much for him, and it would likely be that way for most people. According to John, the event in question was that they were ordered to kill an Iraqi man who was suspected of trying to detonate an IED. Once that man was killed, John shared that members of his unit would go on to open up the deceased's head, pull out his brain, and mutilate his body. They would go on to put that body on top of their Humvee without a body bag and drive it around the city to show everyone that this is what would happen if you mess with the American service members. For John, it was too much. It was far too much. And this is where he started to lose touch with reality and his mental health took a huge dive. According to John's older brother, Mike Jr., John had never been a drinker or into drugs. But in order to numb his moral and physical pain as well as shame and guilt, John was self-medicating with pain pills and alcohol. That same summer, an IED would wipe out 5 of John's teammates. 5. And just when he was set to return home, John received a notice extending his stay in Iraq. John was, to say the very least, not okay. It was at this time John attempted to end his own life. He pulled out a gun in his barracks and went to pull the trigger, but his best friend, who John referred to as Smith, was in the room and actually dived on top of him, wrestling for the gun. John's M9 pistol would miss shooting himself and put a hole in the wall. Now, one would think at this point, command would intervene and recognize that John needed immediate mental health intervention. But this was not the case. Rather than receive help, John was punished. John shared that he began to be treated like a captive. He was held in a small room and isolated, as if he was an insurgent himself, and he wasn't seen by a psychiatrist for a few days. Another soldier in John's unit would be the one to come forward and speak on his behalf later, but the only one to come forward and speak on his behalf. And he testified that John was held in isolation for around 1 month during that time, and he was not receiving any mental health care during that isolation. He was watched by soldiers around the clock, and they had no empathy for his PTSD and mental health issues. They actually accused him of faking those mental health issues. He was being treated as a traitor. John's superiors would record on the record that John was recommended for a court-martial for being drunk and firing his weapon in the barracks. There was zero mention of a suicide attempt or John's severely declining mental health. I'd like to say I'm surprised by this, that the incidences of the military throwing an individual under a bus is just some phenomenon and not the norm. But in fact, it's something I've witnessed all too often. Story after story of women who beg for help and who were turned on. Victims of rape and assault who were essentially blacklisted from their future in the military when they dared to speak out. The military believes no one individual is greater than the mission. And if you don't fall in line, well, you're going to pay. They'll go to great lengths to cover up crimes, rapes, sexual assaults, even murder. Not because they're protecting the perpetrator, but because the cause matters more. The mission matters most. They can't lose their cogs in their machine or suffer the consequences to their reputation. Missions must go on. The higher up you go in brass, the more protected you are from your misdeeds. And for John, who would ultimately serve less than 2 years, despite being an incredible soldier by all accounts, well, his mental health began to suffer, and so did his support from the military. John's dad, Mike Sr., a former military intelligence officer, he caught wind of John's mental health decline and tried to intervene immediately. He called everyone he knew in the military and even reached out to the Pentagon. Mike Needham said he was banging on the door of anyone who might listen, desperate to get his son back home. Eventually, Mike succeeded, and John was sent back to the USA, where he was admitted to Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. John was there at Walter Reed for barely a month, making great progress with his mental health, when he was transferred back to Fort Carson against his and his family's wishes. John and his family felt this was a strategic move by the Army to further punish John for speaking out against his unit and sharing the war crimes they'd committed. John was forced to even go back on duty, though by all accounts his mental health was still in a detrimental condition and the court-martial against John was still being pursued. Mike Needham could tell his son was in dire need of a serious mental health help intervention, so he fought until he could get his son transferred back to a military facility in San Diego where he could keep a watchful eye on him. Unfortunately, rather than go to a top-notch care facility like John needed and was receiving at Walter Reed, John would then bounce in and out of a string of hospitals and clinics in San Diego, and he would be transferred around doctors. And despite the fact that John was adamantly struggling with alcoholism, the military's only solution was to just load him up with more painkiller medication. John's family suspected John had a traumatic brain injury, which would later be confirmed through brain scans. According to John's family, you could see where he was in a cycle of pills throughout his lack of lucidity in the day. There were times of the day when John was so high he was rendered speechless, and he was still struggling with the war crimes he witnessed in Iraq. John pushed for the war crimes to be looked further into, but instead of the military following through on that, the military booted John. They discharged him, and even worse, they would never even give him all the medals they'd awarded him. But perhaps the most egregious thing they did to John was discharge him without full disability, meaning he couldn't go on to get the proper mental health treatment he so desperately needed. I want to put a pin in this story for just a moment and discuss what we owe this nation's war heroes. The very least we could do for the service members and their families is to provide them with the best medical care in the world upon their reintegration home from combat. I think it should be a mandatory part of the reintegration process for these service members to be put right into a mental health facility. Before returning to their families, before they go on vacations, before anything else, send them to a live-in facility treatment where they can get ketamine infusions, a stellate ganglion block, mental health therapy, talk therapy, cognitive therapy, whatever, EMDR, brain scans to assess traumatic brain injuries, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, speech occupational vestibular therapy, prioritize sleep, cold water immersion, whatever they can do to get these members back to health. In their deployment 6 weeks earlier, tack on an additional TDY, but every combat soldier needs to receive the best treatment possible for PTSD as soon as they're back on American soil. Some of these soldiers will go on to deploy again, never having been assessed for brain damage or treated properly. It should be no questions asked. If you deployed into combat, you will come back through a vigorous mental health facility for a period of time. There are wonderful medical miracles happening now that are showing great promise in treating our warfighters, but it needs to be paid for and mandatory for all. I'm getting to the point in the story where John will go on to commit a violent act, and I'll tell that portion. But it's important to note that John is not alone in this. And during the time frame his unit, the 212, returned to Fort Carson in the years 2005 to 2008, 14 soldiers from Fort Carson, including Private John Needham, were charged for or accused of homicide or attempted homicide. In fact, the military decided they had no choice but to do a study at Fort Carson to try and understand all the cluster of violence at Fort Carson. They studied more than 650 Fort Carson soldiers who had experienced high-intensity combat while deployed. About 40% of those soldiers reported being involved in a violent episode after returning home, many of them choking. Now, if you don't know, the number one predictor in domestic violence statistics of if an abuser will kill someone is have they choked them. If an abuser has choked a victim, then they have a statistically 750% increased chance of killing them. So after that study was complete and made headlines, the Army would acknowledge that there seems to be a link between stress of combat soldiers and crimes back home. you think? But officials were quick to point out combat stress doesn't cause violence. It's one of the many factors. And the official response of the Army to their study was that they couldn't pinpoint one issue or risk factor that would result in misconduct of this magnitude. AKA, they weren't willing to sacrifice their mission to acknowledge they had a major, major issue. Those men and women were replaceable to them. Imagine if all those people coming home were sent to a mental health facility and their brains were scanned to assess damage and they were given the proper treatment. Just imagine. So back to John's story. Within days of John being released from the military, he met Jacqwelyn Villagomez. Jackie was stunning. She was 19, a former high school track star who had dreams of becoming a singer and an actress, and she had a beautiful voice. I was actually able to listen to some songs she did covers on up on YouTube a few years ago, but they seem to have all been taken down. But Jackie definitely had what it takes to make it in the business. Just stunning, tall, slender, gorgeous, huge white smile, big, beautiful eyes, and extremely talented. But below that outer shell of protection, Jackie came with her own traumas. Jackie had lost her mother when she was very young to AIDS, and she'd been staying with her grandmother and her brother, but she didn't feel it was a house filled with love, and she really struggled. Jackie was extremely talented and loved by so many friends, but by the end of high school, she was staying with family friends who had embraced her like a family member, but she was still struggling. She began to use drugs. And though she had many talents and huge aspirations, she seemed to float from job to job and was just battling her own demons. She still struggled with the sadness of losing her mother and other issues with her family. She was also drinking in excess to numb her pain, and her and John's relationship was two people trying to deal with their trauma, both numbing their pain with pills and alcohol, and a just very rapidly moving relationship. Jackie started staying with John in an apartment that was below John's father. Mike knew that they had a very tumultuous, alcohol-fueled relationship and that his son needed to be focused on his recovery and mental health and that he was in no shape to be in a serious relationship, especially with someone who was also struggling with addiction and trauma. He voiced his concerns to John and was trying to get him to separate from Jackie to focus on his own recovery, but the couple were drawn to each other and couldn't seem to break away. They'd only known each other for 2 months and were living in John's apartment when things came to a head. There was some kind of fallout. Maybe John tried to break up with Jackie. I couldn't find what spurred this, but Jackie posted this angry post on her Facebook page. She said, "I hope you overdose on sadness. Regret will take over your life until you are in so much pain that you take your own life." Now that's horrible. And from all accounts, Jackie was a lovely girl, so I'm sure this was really out of character for her and likely posted while she wasn't of clear mind. Perhaps sad over their crumbling relationship, and she had an altered mind from substances. But this was just the last straw for Mike Sr., who saw this and intervened. He told his son that Jackie had to move out. He told Jackie he'd give her money to go find a place and get on her feet, but he wouldn't permit her to stay there while John was so unhealthy and they were so unhealthy for each other. And John and Jackie concurred. That last night, Jackie and John were caught on camera at an Orange County grocery store walking hand in hand. To anybody looking on, they just looked like two young lovers just out for a fun night. They'd purchased a bottle of vodka. Apparently, they decided to have one last round together before they said their goodbyes. Nobody could have predicted how that night would end. As the story's told, Jackie said her goodbye to John and was leaving the apartment when she passed another woman walking towards the apartment. That woman was John's ex-girlfriend, a woman named Renee. According to a 911 call Renee would go on to make, Jackie would follow her back into John's apartment and physically attack her. John had separated them both and was physically restraining a very angry and aggressive Jackie. He urged Renee to leave, and Renee actually said that she escaped through the bathroom window. On the phone, Renee would report that Jackie was the aggressor, not John, and at the time when Renee left, she didn't see any blood and Jackie was fine, but being restrained by John. But in the short time it took deputies to arrive on scene, that all changed. What police would find when they arrived was Jackie in a near-death state, and John naked, crying, and completely covered in smeared blood. Blood all over the walls, and Jackie's face beaten so badly her beautiful features were unrecognizable. They were unable to subdue John or get him to snap out of it, and they had to taser him to get him subdued. His fists were the only weapons to be found. In photographs the police would take of his hands, his knuckles are bruised, torn, and swollen, covered in blood, and they wrapped them in paper bags to preserve the evidence before taking him to interview. John would go on to be interviewed and could offer very little insight. He shared that he didn't really know what happened, just that he was a veteran and he had issues. You can actually see his rage in the videos of his interviews. And once again, that is on the 48 Hours episode, Private Needham's War, which you can find the podcast of on 48 Hours podcast. But you can see his rage and little outbursts while they're interviewing him. And he's just, out of sorts. He doesn't know what happened except for he has PTSD. So John would go on to be charged with Jackie's murder, September 2nd of 2008. And prosecutors would claim that it was John's drinking and a drunken rage that caused him to beat Jackie to death. John spent 10 months in a maximum security jail cell. Can you imagine what this man's mental health must have been like after everything he'd been through? No mental health treatment, and now he's jailed with some of the worst criminals in the country after having given his own health over to our country. Now, John's father, during that 10-month stretch, was actually able to raise the $1 million needed for John's bail so he could get out prior to his murder trial. During the time between his jail time and his pending trial, John would have a surgery on his back that unfortunately just did not go well. And so now John was in even more excruciating pain, and his reliance on painkillers became a severe addiction. So he was hospitalized to deal with that. After a stretch of trying to overcome his painkiller addiction, the family sent him to be with his mother at her home in Tucson, Arizona, hoping that he could recover away from the noise of the pending trial in Southern California. There would be 2 more surgeries during that time frame to try to repair John's deteriorating back. And if that wasn't all enough to be dealing with, John had a serious infection after his last surgery and a tumor the size of a grapefruit on his back, according to his father. But the VA didn't keep him inpatient. They released him. The only caretaker during that time for him was a nurse who would come by his home. The military abandoned John. It makes no sense. On February 19th, John Needham would be found dead in his mother's home in Tucson. His brother Mike found him, slumped over in bed, his face blue. All efforts to revive him were exhausted, but he died in his brother's arms. The toxicology reports would go on to show that Needham had died by overdose, but whether it was intentional or accidental, nobody confirmed. I watched an interview with his grandmother who believes it was an accident. His mother thought she heard him fall prior and believed he was in a great deal of pain and just took too many painkillers. But others felt it was intentional, as John had attempted suicide in the past. The final autopsy report would show undetermined. But no matter which way you slice it, 2 people and multiple families were devastated because of the absolute neglect and even intentional pain inflicted on John Needham by the military. I'm not sure how you listeners have come to find this. Maybe you don't feel the same way, but I've welcomed home a soldier from combat, nursed him or tried to nurse him back to health with a traumatic brain injury and even one time a gunshot. I've seen that dead stare in their eyes, the descent into alcoholism and even drug abuse. I've watched what war does to a person, and I even felt at times during that relationship that my ex had it in him to kill me. There were nights I feel if I would not have had an escape plan, I would have experienced the same fate as Jacqwelyn Villagomez. The military makes these combat war fighters weapons. They make them weapons and they don't care when they are broken because, quite frankly, it doesn't always affect their ability to be good in combat. These war fighters are incredibly good at compartmentalizing. They can be in dire mental health, condition, and still go into war and be a solid combat soldier. They're very good at segmenting off parts of their minds. I hate to say it, but this is why so many of them are able to cheat and then go home and look their spouses in the eye and lie. Sorry if that offends any of you, but I don't want to burst your bubble here. But in my experience, I'd say more combat soldiers cheat than don't. I can't think of a single one I knew who didn't cheat when downrange. I'm sure they exist. I'm sure they do. But from everything I witnessed, those are the exceptions and not the rule, because they can compartmentalize. It's 2 different lives for them. The military doesn't care how broken they are. I even had one of my ex-husband's command tell me that they like their combat soldiers crazy. But what happens when these men don't get the help they need and the men stop compartmentalizing and they come home and they can't turn off the war? Women die. And that's what's happening. The military wash their hands of soldiers when they can no longer serve them. They're just broken toys. This is the result you get. They throw them out, and then we see veterans take their own lives, take others' lives, or end up homeless on the street. But what if it wasn't that way? Had he stayed at Walter Reed receiving top-level mental health treatment, I truly believe he could have been restored. He may have had to continue long-term treatment for his traumatic brain injury, but I believe he would have had a life worth living, and he and Jackie would still be alive. I don't understand why these men are sent back to their lives with no respite or stringent evaluation between. Somewhere in the early 2000s, somebody with a lot of stripes on their arms decided that combat vets could take a quick little trip through Qatar to have some Chili's wings, sleep in a hotel, maybe go to a mall and grab some bootleg DVDs, and they thought that this counts as a little mental health break. But what if, like I said earlier, what if every single one went to an inpatient rehabilitation for a month or 6 weeks? I know they want to get home, but it does them no good to go home in a mental health crisis. They're going into homes where many of them are the only income earner due to the challenges of finding childcare and holding a job as a military spouse. They have the financial pressures on their shoulders, and we don't pay them enough, especially during these times. Many have new babies and toddlers or pregnant spouses. It's a recipe for disaster or family annihilation. And for the few who may not be struggling with PTSD, that's okay. I'm sure every single person could benefit from top-level mental health therapy for a month. Teach them how to cope with the stress of integrating back into the daily life as a family. I think one of the most important components of it all would be to identify brain injuries. When we look at brain scans of people with traumatic brain injuries and TBIs, those people can have brain bleeding, blood clots, swelling, skull fractures. They can have small confusions. Just a myriad of things can be happening that you may not see from the outside. They can totally go undetected. Soldiers redeploy with brain injuries, and I know this from personal experience. Some of the ways brain injuries can affect a person are cognitive thinking skills, double vision, dizziness, ringing in the ears, hearing loss, challenges focusing, memory loss. They can have learning difficulties. Their judgment and reasoning can be gravely affected. Their ability to make sound decisions, their ability to understand nonverbal signs. They also might have major behavioral issues like a lack of awareness or difficulty with self-control. They may have physical and verbal outbursts, and they might have major emotional changes. Those emotional changes, they can include depression, anxiety, mood swings, irritability, lack of empathy for others, anger, rage, insomnia, and some research suggests that it can actually lead to higher risk of a degenerative brain disease like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Look at Muhammad Ali. That guy had to have a few brain injuries. Now, why would you not want to identify a condition like this at the earliest possible point of intervention? Well, from what I witnessed, and in John Needham's case, the military was very much operating under a don't ask, don't tell mindset. Meaning if a service member came forward and raised their hand and said, hey, I'm having issues, I think I'm struggling with PTSD or a traumatic brain injury, then that bell's been rung. There are programs that person can go to and the military can set them up. However, if you don't want to be put on a waiver or pulled from deployment rotation, you got to keep that shit to yourself. And so many of these combat soldiers do just that. In John Needham's case, when he incurred his broken back and head trauma, like I said earlier, he was encouraged to lie during his medical appointment right after the injury occurred so he wouldn't be sent home. He was put right back onto patrol the very next day. And I don't think he's an outlier. These men are worth millions of dollars in their combat training. They don't want to lose their weapon. But John Needham's performance began to suffer. He was falling asleep on assignments and forgetful. He was just having a number of problems. And then when he spoke out about the war crimes, well, that was the nail in the coffin. The military no longer needed that broken toy, and they threw him out. If there's a stopgap and all of these combat soldiers are evaluated and treated before they return home to their families, I think a number of them would be medically discharged from the military due to traumatic brain injuries. Anybody who's dealing with explosive or blast over pressure from weapons systems or breaching can in fact have a TBI. And it's not what the service member wants or the military wants to pull them from rotation or to even discharge them, but they might be preventing these veterans from killing someone else or losing their own battles to suicide. But you might be thinking, like, Tressa, come on, that would cost millions or billions of dollars to implement a program like this for every single soldier that saw combat. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Do you know how much money the United States has given in military aid to foreign countries in the last few years? Billions. In the hundreds of billions. Do you know whose country needs military aid right now? This motherfucking country does. This one. Don't get it twisted, because I am all for helping other nations, but we're in a crisis here with our veterans' mental health. And a lot of people are paying the price. We have to take care of our country first. So today, I leave you with this question. Do you think that these military members would be killing themselves and their family had they had the proper treatment post-combat? I'm sure there's a percentage of them who are narcissistic, abusive, bad actors because they exist in every career field. If you look hard enough, you can find kindergarten teachers killing their spouses and families. And probably there's an argument that a greater percentage of them exist in the military and police forces, as those power positions attract personality types who are thirsty for power and titles. And there's people who come with generational trauma and probably should never be in the career field where they're experiencing more trauma and they just don't have the mental capacity to handle combat and they react badly, very badly. But there's also a lot of amazing humans who are being failed by the system. And I firmly believe that a lot of these incidences wouldn't be happening if the proper support were in place. So I'm here to fight for change. I want to thank you for listening. It's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, so I'll be sharing many more stories on my TikTok. You can find me there at Tressa.Brady or on Instagram, HealTheWounded13. If you have a story you'd like me to look into or share yourself, you can email me at healingwounds13@gmail.com. Also, thanks for sticking with me. I know my episodes have been intermittent at best lately, but stick around or hit the follow button now because I've been working to record more and I'm going to be getting more consistent. I've got several exciting guests lined up and I look forward to releasing a lot more episodes on a regular basis as I continue to get more guests and support. If you are a veteran suffering with mental health issues, please dial 988 or you can chat online at veteranscrisisline.net. If you are the victim of domestic violence and you need help, please call From a Safe Phone, 800-799-7233, or text the word BEGIN to 88788. Sources for today's show can be found in my show notes. Please stay safe and don't lose hope. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you think this content would be helpful for someone you know, please share the link with them. Sources can be found in the show notes of today's episode.